and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 80, bringing on an author and talking with them about one, occasionally more, of their books in detail. I'm Charlie Place, and today I am joined by Elissa Soave, who won the inaugural Prima Donna Prize. We'll be talking today about her debut, Ginger and Me, and, well, they say don't judge a book by its cover, but I saw this one and that was it for me. I had to read this book. And it did not disappoint. It was so much more than I expected. The book is the first-person narrative of 19-year-old Wendy, who is a bus driver. Her mum died some months ago. Wendy is struggling. Her social worker has given her some advice, but it's difficult to apply. No one wants to be friends with Wendy. No one seems to like her. It seems she always says the wrong thing. But two significant events happen. One, Wendy comes across local writer Diane and finds a lot to relate to in her tweets. And two, a girl called Ginger gets on Wendy's bus, and for once it seems like friendship may happen. That's a ton for me. That's absolutely enough for me. Hello, Elissa.
Hello. I thought that was a brilliant description, actually, of the book.
Phew, I'm glad you liked it. I know it was quite long, but I wanted to get everything that was pertinent in there. I'm going to have to start with, I know you're going to get these questions a lot. You probably will in future, but how did you come to write Ginger and Me? What was the starting point?
Well, I'm Scottish, as you can probably tell. So I knew that I was going to write a story set in Scotland. And more than that, I was quite keen to set it in a small, sort of relatively unknown part of Scotland, trying to make the point that, although we're very used to hearing stories from London and Paris and Dublin, say, big, exciting places. Actually, people in small, so-called unexciting places also have valid stories to tell. So that was my starting point. Initially, I started to write a story about someone who became obsessed with a famous author. And that is something I think probably came about from my time scrolling through Twitter. All of a sudden, you've got access, if you like, to famous authors. So I think that's probably where the idea came from originally. As I started to write that story, I started to think about, well, what sort of person would that be? Because if it's a person who has friends and family, surely they would say to her, Wendy, just because you have a Twitter connection with this author, it doesn't mean that you're best friends and you've got this relationship, which is what Wendy thinks. So it became clear to me then that Wendy would have to have a background where she has no family, she has no friends really to advise her. And then the focus of the book then changed, because then I was starting to think about, well, why would that happen? How could that be? And unfortunately, I sort of came to the conclusion that it would be quite easy for somebody to have no friends and family. If you've just got a small family and something happens to them, and if, like Wendy, you find it difficult to make friends, you could quite easily find yourself on the outside of a community. So I really wanted to explore that, and what does a community mean? And as members of a community, do we have a sort of a duty to each other to make sure people are not like Wendy and on the outside? And how could Wendy and people like Wendy, become more part of a community?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because obviously I've been researching you before I came to
really?
it. Yeah, well, I've been listening to you talk about your book. And I know when I got to the end of Ginger and Me, I really felt that the book seemed to be a lot about effectively the failings of social and mental health care potentially, and also the way that society needs to be better at accepting people and just more open, I suppose. And then I heard that you were talking about friendship as well. It was really interesting to hear that and think about how I'd kind of read the book. But given you've started on that, I will get to this question now. Could you talk about this, about the way that there is difference in your book, Wendy, furthering what you've just said?
Well, I'm really pleased that that's what you took from the book, because obviously I want to tell a story that entertains people and makes them laugh as well some of the time. But it's really good as well, I think, to, I guess, say things that you're concerned about, to try and make the reader engage with certain issues. So for me, I wanted to write a character that was slightly different to the norm, because I wanted to say, well, why do we all have to be the same? From our school days onwards, and I know this of my own children, the thing that is most important is fitting in. We've all got to be the same, and that seems to be the most important thing that parents and people are worried about. I really wanted to say, well, can't you just be different? Can't you just plough your own furrow, but still have friends and still find your own place? And I actually think Wendy does this brilliantly. Wendy, when we first meet her, doesn't have friends, and our social worker says to her, you've got to make connections, Wendy. We all need more than just to be on our own. And Wendy really takes that on board, and she makes friends on the bus, the women on the bus. She makes friends at the writers' group, and most importantly, she makes friends with Ginger. But I think the important part in relation to the question you just asked me is when people just accept Wendy for the way she is and don't judge her for the silly things that she says and the very literal view that she takes of the world, when people just take her for the way she is, they actually find that she's funny, she's loyal, she's a hardworking person, she's resilient. I mean, she's got so many great qualities that you would want in a friend. So I guess if you can just accept everybody for the way they are and look for the good things about them that draw you to them, that's a great way to be.
Well, with what you said, obviously we're accepting people as they are, which is great, it's how it should be. But you do, in this, I suppose, on this topic, you don't label as such Wendy. There are suggestions within the text that maybe she's autistic. I found a suggestion that potentially, although I think this became lesser as the book went on, that maybe she suffered from some trauma. So I suppose I want to say it was important to you not to label or be too specific about what's going on.
And to be perfectly honest about this, first of all, partly it was because I'm not an expert. I was keen not to say that she had Asperger's, autism, neurodivergence, partly because I hadn't gone and really researched what these things were. So I wasn't trying to say, look, I'm an expert in, for example, autism, and this is how an autistic person would react. And I was concerned that people who knew a lot more about autism than me would say, well, actually, no, that's not the case. I mean, it may be that there are certain circumstances in the book where Wendy does act in a way that is not consistent with a person who has autism. And that's okay, because I'm not portraying that. Although it's interesting to me that I've read quite a few reviews that say things along the lines, the author has clearly researched this. I mean, I really hadn't. However, I do recognise that a lot of the traits that Wendy has, she has in common with people who have autism, Asperger's, neurodivergence. And I really just wanted to say, in line with what I was saying, that we're all different, do we need a label? Can't we be at some point along this spectrum but not be labelled as such? Because my worry about that is once you label a person with whatever it may be, there's a tendency to sort of pigeonhole everything they do under that label. And I just really would rather be free, and that people would be free to be themselves. But I feel as though I have to be sort of slightly careful about that, because a lot of parents, I think, take comfort in a label, in a diagnosis. And it's a way to sort of, I guess, deal with certain behaviours that their children are exhibiting. So I'm sensitive to that. But for me personally, I didn't want Wendy to be labelled like that.
Yeah, no, I suppose you've got to be careful with labels. They can make things easier for the person as well. But then at the same point, you've got to be careful because they can kind of take the individual out of it as well.
Exactly. And also I think that people grow and develop and change. And I think just allowing people to be themselves and accepting them for the way they are. And incidentally, although Wendy does want to go out and make friends, not everybody does. So I also am conscious that being alone is not always being lonely. For some people, that's what they want. But for Wendy definitely wanted more of a sense of community, wants to belong more and have other friends. I mean, certainly at the beginning, when Ginger and Wendy become friends, it's a very positive thing for both of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you say at the beginning, I got the feeling, and this is proved throughout, it's nice that you get this feeling early on, that Wendy does effectively have friends in the people on the bus. They're effectively acquaintances. She sees them just for a short period of time, but they actually seem to like her. And I kind of wanted to ask about this. I know they're included mostly as names. We don't hear so much from them. We don't hear so much dialogue. But can you tell us about these people on the bus? You've got, I think, Irish Mary, Myra. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, Irish Mary, Myra and Terry are a group of older women. In my mind, they're sort of in their mid-70s, late 70s even. And what I wanted to try and get across with them was that they are just full of joie de vivre. They're on the bus because they're on their way to their dance club. They're on their way to a do at one of the church halls. They're living life and enjoying life. And I guess I really feel that although we read a lot in books about major things happening, big events, actually, there's a lot of joy in everyday life. There's a lot of joy in growing older, having friends, doing things that you enjoy, taking the bus up to your dance club and having fun. And they're funny. They're supposed to be letting us know that life on Wendy's bus is fun. The bus is Wendy's world, and she's in charge of that world. And I think she does it really, really well. And the fact that these lovely women like her and are part of her sort of daily routine, that's supposed to add to, the sense of community that she's developing on the bus. Somebody said to me once, and it's a compliment, she said to me that the book was really full of humanity. And that's really what I wanted it to be. I wanted to try and be non-judgmental and have a variety of different people coming in and out, going about their business and doing, if you like, small things, but things that gave them joy. So the women on the bus are definitely part of that.
No, I absolutely agree with the compliment there. And I mean, I love that I opened this book and you've got Wendy and you've got the bus and it was so relatable. That's something that I took away from it. The fact that you've got these very ordinary people, you've got people from the working class that are just living their lives and doing things. And this was an important thing for you to do, explore the lives of the working class.
Yes, and particularly young working class girls, because we just don't hear from them enough. In life generally, in my opinion, I mean, the things that happen to Ginger, I could easily see them happening to a young girl in real life because that's the way our society is. And you have to ask yourself, why are we failing young girls like Ginger? And maybe it's because we don't hear from them. So we don't know what it is that they need. So it was important to me to give a voice to someone like Ginger, who has no power otherwise. And the same with Wendy. I think particularly writing in the first person is important because it's a way of giving people who don't have power, it's a way of giving them power because you're allowing them to say, we Ginger from View Park, right? Who is going to tell her story if not Ginger? So it's a way of being able to say, look, these are the things that happened to me and this is how I feel about them, not what some person higher up who makes decisions for society, not what they think she should feel and she should be doing. It's how she feels. And I just think it's so important to give a voice to people who don't otherwise have a voice.
Now, you saying things there, it's made me think that we often hear a story once significant things have happened. So like in your case, we'd hear what happens at the end of the story. But then as you're showing, you're giving us the crucial part of what happens before, for example. Can you tell us about Ginger?
I absolutely love Ginger. In fact, somebody asked me once, was she the main character? And I think the answer is no to that. I think Wendy is the main character. But Ginger is somebody, to me, who has so much potential. She's a young girl who is born to nothing, really, and has nothing. And, that was important, I felt. A lot of readers, I think, will not know girls like Ginger. And they themselves, and me, we have choices. Do we want to go to university? Do we want to do something else? Ginger really has no choices. And I think that for a girl who has nothing, has nobody to support her, she gives it a bloody good go. She's always like, come on, Wendy, we can do this. Let's go out. Let's have fun. I just love her resilience. Funny, you mentioned the cover in your introduction. And of course, that's supposed to be Ginger on the cover. As soon as I saw that, I thought there's just something about that figure that says Ginger to me, because she's so sort of, in Glasgow, we say gallus. I don't know if you know what that means. She's so sort of up for it and, come on then, I'm going to do my best. So Ginger, I love Ginger.
You say about the cover, yes, I did wonder for a while I kind of got that was Ginger on the cover. At the same time, I was kind of like, I want this to be Wendy at some point in her life, becoming that kind of person. But no, yeah, that it's Ginger, it absolutely works. I'm going to have to ask about Diane. Can you just tell us about her? Same sort of thing as Ginger, where she came from, etc.
Well, as a character, I really like Diane. And when I was writing her, I just took her completely at face value. She's a very seasoned writer and is a bit sort of fed up with the way the publishing world works and thinks that it lacks diversity, particularly for working class writers. And then she comes across this working class writer, Wendy, and I think she's very kind to her most of the time, considering what she has to put up with from Wendy towards the end, certainly. So I liked Diane, and I just took her completely at face value. So I was very surprised that a lot of readers are very upset with Diane and say, oh my goodness, she seems like another one of these writers that talks a good game about diversity, but as soon as she gets the chance to do something about it, she sort of backs off. And I have to say, when that was pointed out to me, I thought, actually, that's true. You don't have to scroll Twitter for very long to see lots of authors like Diane who believe in the same sort of things as Diane believes in and talk about, the publishing industry and how things can be different, blah, blah, blah. But I agree that a lot of the time, when you sort of scratch below the surface, there isn't much happening. They're not doing very much beyond that. And I think I'd have to agree that Diane's a bit like that. I mean, she encourages Wendy to a point, but does she really help her? Not really.
Yeah, it is a good point. I mean, she could have possibly helped her. I suppose, yeah, she had to think about how Wendy was being. Would Wendy have got even more obsessed, I suppose we could say, about her? But yeah, there were definitely times when you think, well, maybe she could have taken her under a wing a bit more. Yeah, definitely. So is there any of you in this book?
Wendy, when she has no friends, I definitely had a period in my life where I was like that. When I went to university, I went very, very young. I went at 16, which was absolutely stupid. I don't know why that happened. And I studied law. So I think for one thing, I was too young. And for another thing, for whatever reason, I felt as though I didn't fit in. So I went through a period where I didn't have friends. So I definitely think I was able to draw upon that for Wendy, how Wendy felt quite an outsider. And one of the things that I would like to sort of get across to readers is finding yourself with no friends isn't a personal failing. There's all sorts of reasons why you might find yourself not at the centre of things where you might like to be. And for one thing, it's usually a transitory state. Be glad to know I do have friends now. And for another thing, I think if we were all honest, we would all say there's been periods like that in our lives. I think so anyway. It's how you deal with it that's important. And I think Wendy deals with it brilliantly. Wendy is out there making her connections, joining a club. I mean, I would never have dreamed of joining a club when I had no friends and wasn't going out or anything like that. I just wouldn't have had the nerve, the chutzpah to go and do that. And Wendy does. So I admire her for that.
You've made me think of how, of course, the internet makes it a lot easier, but we are having these conversations now and there are articles written about it, about how so many people are lonely and so many people don't have friends or take a long time to get friends. And it is wonderful to see that happening, to kind of let people know that, yeah, like you say, it's not a one-off thing. So many people experience it.
I was going to say, I think it also comes back to this idea of community. And as a society, what are we prepared to put our money into, to put our money where our mouth is? So for Wendy, something that really helped her in the initial stages was going to the library. So libraries, I think, are great institutions for community and for making friends. Somewhere that you can go alone. It's free. You can meet like-minded people. Nobody's going to question, why are you there? What are you doing here? So I guess that's a sort of a pillar of our community that I would love to see more championed than it is. In fact, if anything, the opposite seems to be happening, where libraries are being cut back and cut back. I was at an event at Shettleston Library. It's a library near Glasgow quite recently. And it was before all this hot weather. And they had an initiative where it was a warm space and people could go in just to be warm. And there was a lovely group meeting at the same time as my event was on. In fact, I was probably driving them crazy. And they were a knitting group. And it wasn't just women either. It was women and men, all ages, knitting. But as they were knitting, they were all chatting and talking to each other. And I thought that's a really lovely thing. And where could you do that if not the library?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah, libraries are welcoming. And actually, let's progress to the writing group. Can you tell us, I suppose, about this writing group, why you've written them, how you've written them, all that kind of thing?
Well, of course, I did go to a writers group myself when I started writing. And honestly, whenever anybody asks me for advice on how should you start writing or how can you improve your writing, I always say join a writers group. From that, you can see that the characters at my writing group were not the same as the characters at Wendy's writing group, who a lot of the time are not that helpful to Wendy. The writers group does provide some comic relief in the dark themes of the novel, so I wasn't being entirely serious in the characters there. But having said that, I have been in a number of groups, online mostly, where there are definitely people whose main goal is not to help you to improve your writing. There are definitely people who make sort of comments and say snidey things, and it's not really to be helpful. There's a lot of humble bragging goes on in these groups, particularly once you've got a publishing deal. It's not framed like this, but this is really the message. I'm better than you because. And I just think that's so unhelpful. With writing in particular, if somebody else does well, it doesn't mean that you don't do well. To me, if somebody in my group does well, I am delighted, not least because, well, that's somebody just like me, so then that could be me. So I think writers' groups are fantastic. Mine certainly was fantastic. But I think you have to choose carefully. You'll very soon become aware of who is there to help you and who isn't. And perhaps I should say, though, that in my experience, most writers that are in these groups are helpful writers. And I think writing is such a solitary endeavour most of the time, which, I think people don't really like that about it. So a lot of people that say they want to write, well, they don't really want to sit at their desks for hours on their own. But because it is so much solitary work, it is nice to go and be with a group who are all as interested in plotting and characters and voice as you are. And I think as long as you go with the idea that you're going to get criticism, that's the point. You won't improve if you don't go and get the feedback from other writers. So as long as you go with that in mind, it's helpful. And I think that is where Wendy slightly falls down, because Wendy goes thinking that she is the next Booker Prize winner from the word go. So I don't think she's really there to get feedback. And when she does get feedback, she quite often says, oh, that's here. He didn't know what he's talking about. I don't think she gets much from it.
I love that you included a sample of her writing so that we could see what it was like and we could really get it. Yeah, that was great. A sacrifice or something in there. And yeah, given what you said, particularly, I like then that you have got about, rounded up, I suppose, half the writers group aren't great and don't get Wendy at all. And then you as a reader, you're definitely going, oh, I hope somebody gets Wendy. And then you do have Muriel and Sophie who seem to get her. And actually, Sophie's brilliant because some of the things that Wendy said to her are really quite shocking.
Yes.
Yeah. But, it's lovely that happens. And then that she has effectively got these two friends. I don't know if she ends up calling them friends, I suppose, because she's thinking of Diane as a friend and that kind of thing.
I think they think they're her friends more than she thinks. I think she's got a sense of, why would they be friends with me? But she's a great person, Wendy. Gosh, is that like a mother saying that about their own children? They're great. But I do love Wendy. I mean, as you can tell, I love Wendy and Ginger. It's not difficult for me to see why people would like her and find her great company. I would. Yeah,
I expect that Wendy in real life would very much appreciate having you as a friend. So she's got you as a writer. You created her. That will have to do. But yeah, I want to ask about setting. We've kind of talked roughly around the subject somewhat, but you've got Uddingston, where you are from, and you're talking to me from there today.
Yeah.
Setting seems very important, almost like a character in this book. Is that correct at all to say that?
I think that is true to say. I can't really imagine the story anywhere but Uddingston now that it's there. Uddingston, it's a place, like many places, of extremes. So there are pockets of real affluence, cheek by jowl with more socially deprived areas. So it provided a great setting for the kind of story that I wanted to tell. It's really a way of emphasising how different your life chances can be depending on where you're born. So it's a great setting from that point of view. When I originally wrote this story, Uddingston really didn't feature that much. So in my naivety as a first-time novelist, I thought if I make it so obviously Uddingston, it will narrow down the appeal, because who's going to want to read about Uddingston? And I had a meeting with an agent early on, not my current agent, and she gave me great advice, and I'm really grateful to her for it. She said that people love a sense of place. People love to be able to place themselves exactly where the story is. You need to pin that down more. And I honestly hadn't even really thought about the setting. They went to various places, but I didn't really describe it. And once I started to think about various places in Uddingston and really trying to take the reader to these places, particularly because the bus features, the buses going by these places. So I think it's important that the reader knows where they're going. Once I sort of gave myself freedom to do that, I really loved writing about Uddingston. It made me think about places I hadn't thought about for years.
It's interesting you say that, and you say about worried about talking about it too much. I know, of course, it's years back now, but I was talking to Laura Pearson, and she had set her book in my city in Southampton, and I was all over it. I was like, my goodness, because I can see where everything is here, and I know where these characters are going. I'm guessing people from Uddingston have really enjoyed your book.
Yes, and honestly, that has just been so lovely. So I'm afraid I've got a bit of a Greg's habit, so I'm up there just practically every day getting my cappuccino and my pastry, and almost without fail, every week, at least once a week, every week, somebody stops me to say, oh, I loved your book. Oh, I read your book.
Brilliant.
And once actually I was at the cross at Uddingston, and somebody leaned out their car window and said, I've just bought your Audible. And I just think it's so lovely that as a community, they are behind it. Another writer did say to me, I think you're the first to set something in South Lanarkshire. I don't know if that's true or not, but I mean, if it is, you can see why people are so delighted, because it's a bit like saying, it's a bit like a love letter, isn't it, to Uddingston? Because I do love Uddingston. And I hope, anyway, the fact that I know it so well is what has allowed me to describe it in such detail.
Yeah. I haven't been to Uddingston, but the reality of the place really comes across. It's lovely. You say about going to Greg's, I can relate to that. I had a time of going for breakfast there. It's nice. But talking about food itself seems important for itself, I suppose you could say. In your book, you've got the Tunnock's tea cakes, you've got the factory, of course, you've got the steak pie that Wendy goes for, and she keeps going to get that after her mum's died. It had been their ritual, effectively. You've got the chips that Ginger goes and gets, and is food important for itself?
I mean, the instances that you talked about, apart from the chips one, that's more about Wendy and her mum bonding. Because I think at the time, and it's probably true of a lot of us, she didn't really appreciate her mum and the advice that her mum was giving her and the support that her mum was giving her. So I was trying to convey that. As soon as something was wrong with Wendy, she knew immediately. And she said, Mum, we'll go to Tunnock's, go and have a cup of tea and a Tunnock's tea cake. So it was more, I guess, a way of showing love, that her mum was showing love to her. I'm from an Italian background, and that is how we show love. We offer you food. Everybody's got to have food. Everybody's got to eat. So actually, you said earlier on, was there anything of me in the characters? Maybe that is a subconsciously, because I am always concerned about, oh, yeah, have you eaten? Or do you want some tea? Do you want, maybe that is why there's so many mentions of food in the novel, which I haven't thought about before.
Oh, that was interesting to hear, and your take on it, and the difference to my question is actually far more interesting than the answer that might have come from my question. My question was, yeah. But yeah, no, it was interesting to see that. And you say about the bond between Wendy and her mum, and we do hear so much about her mother. But I'll bring it in now. There's a kind of vagarity, I suppose, not too much. We do get a lot as the reader with Wendy's parents. How did you want the reader to view Wendy's parents?
I suppose I wanted them to be sympathetic. Wendy's father has an alcohol problem and dies an alcoholic, but I didn't want that to be, what a rascal, off at the pub all the time, spending the family's money. No, I wanted it to be that this could happen to anybody. He lost his job, he couldn't get another job, he got redundancy money. It's a sort of self-soothing thing that he started to drink. And it didn't mean that he didn't love his family or that he didn't do his best for his family. And there's a poignant scene in the book towards the end where he's saying to Wendy that, he just got used to people treating him like dirt as he shook his cup and tried some way to get some money, and he ends up, down and out homeless. So I guess I wanted him to be sympathetic. I also wanted Wendy's mum to come across a very strong woman, because I think she is a very strong woman, or was a very strong woman. She was not having it that anybody would say anything about Wendy or treat Wendy in any way badly. And I think working class literature, there's a sort of a bugbear that I have about it, that often it's told only from a male perspective. And so we get all about the drinking and the gang culture and the fighting and all the things that unfortunately Glasgow is famous for. And I don't say that these things are not part of the city and part of our culture, certainly historically, but I just think that if you tell a story from a woman's perspective, it would be different. And all these sort of working class novels that we have from men, they tend to sideline the women. The women are always like the loyal girlfriend or the mum with a pot of soup in the background but does nothing else. So I really wanted the women in my story to be driving the story, to be the real central force of the story. And so I wanted Wendy's mum not to be somebody that had had a hard life, was suffering. No, Wendy's mum was a very strong woman, a very capable woman, and she really did stand Wendy in good stead.
With what you said, it's made me wonder, would you consider her a main character?
I think for Wendy and for Wendy's development, she's a main character. The reason that Wendy is the way she is, Wendy's quite a confident person in some ways. She's not shy about giving her opinions and thinking that her writing's brilliant, for example, and taking control of a bus. I wouldn't like to drive a bus, would you? Yeah. Have charge of all these passengers, and Wendy can do that. So I think for Wendy, yeah, her mum is definitely a main character.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask you some questions about the ending. If Sanvi had pushed for more information, Sanvi, the support worker, if she had pushed more for information of Wendy, because Wendy thinks of loads of things she could say and then she doesn't, would Wendy have been okay, effectively?
I think so. I think Sanvi could have done more, which is not really a criticism of Sanvi. I think the way our social services are, they're underfunded, everybody is overstretched, undervalued. So I think for Sanvi, it was very much a case of, oh, you're fine, great, you're fine, and then on to the next person. And I don't think it is right that we have to expect people to go over and above their job in order to do it well and to stop tragedies from happening. But I think you're right that if she'd probed a little deeper, things might not have turned out the way they did.
Mm-hmm. You definitely in the book do show that it's not Sanvi herself. It is the structure and the routine and the time, the management effectively that she's got to follow. I think that's also where I saw in the book a commentary on social care, because it's definitely not her as an individual, it's the whole thing going on.
And also the fact that between the two girls, Wendy and Ginger, Wendy gets a support worker, but actually it's Ginger that needs one more. How can that happen? What has gone wrong there? Wendy is lucky that her boss goes to visit her and sees immediately that there's something wrong and sorts things out for her. But Ginger doesn't have that. Why does she not have that? She's a 15-year-old girl, she's vulnerable, she's got no one. I just think that's a great sadness.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she falls out of society's notice, I suppose, because of where she is. You'd like to think that, yeah, if she's in school, that someone would see something, whether they will or not, you wouldn't know, except in the individual circumstances. But she's not able to go to school as much as she would like to, and then you just drop out of attention completely.
I mean, even the fact that she doesn't go to school, there's a sort of a cursory attempt to find out why. But again, our schools are stretched as well, aren't they? There's so many pupils, and so she just falls out of, there's no safety net for her.
Certainly, and just reading on the internet and people's experiences they've had, people who've been in not necessarily Ginger's position, but maybe similar or had difficult home lives, and they're saying, why were people not there? And I think there is a big push for things to get better, but I suppose it's also difficult for people who aren't necessarily in the situations to see what's going on, if that makes sense.
Uh-huh. I mean, this is the beauty of books, isn't it? In fact, Diane herself in the book says, quotes Katsui Shiguro, who says something along the lines of, and he does, this is true, he did say this, something along the lines of, books are about, well, this is how it feels for me. Is that how it feels for you? And I think that is a fantastic way to describe a book. So really what you're trying, as well as entertainment, of course, you're asking for 10 hours of a reader's time. Of course, you're going to entertain with a story. But it's also a way of saying, look, this is how it is for somebody like Ginger. Do you understand? Can you see? It's a great way to sort of raise awareness of things. There's an opportunity in literature to say more and to comment on our society, to comment on the way things work, and just to sort of say, well, is this right? Are we happy with this?
No, absolutely. And listeners, I'm nodding my head furiously at what Elissa's saying because I completely agree. That is, I think, the defining thing for me with your book, actually, that you have written this thing that allows people to see the inner workings of people's head. And Wendy, as an example, we do have these examples. And I know that I felt similarly to when I read Eleanor Oliphant is completely fine. That
Yes,
kind of representation of difference. Yeah, this is the whole reason I think that I liked your book so much, that there is this communication. This is kind of furthering out, I suppose, maybe. Was it ever an option for you to have Ginger alive at the end? How would this have changed what you wanted to say?
You know, if I'm being completely honest, there's been several times recently where I've thought to myself, I wish I hadn't killed her. And the reason I say that is because I'm a debut novelist, right? So I think in my naivety, I genuinely had not expected, to not imagine in a million years that readers would love these characters in the way that I do. I did not imagine that they'd become invested in Ginger's life. And so many readers now have told me that they were heartbroken by the fact that she dies at the end. And I completely can see why, because I was very upset. You know, the scene where Wendy is cradling her on the ground, I was very upset when I wrote that. So I completely see why, you know, I've upset people there. I feel sorry for that. But also, as a writer, I think I was slightly naive because I was thinking that Ginger's life was on this tragic trajectory, right? Things were getting worse and worse. So I was thinking that at the end, then the most tragic thing will happen. I couldn't see another way. But now I think, well, couldn't it have been that this scenario happened at Diane's house? And because these two girls then were brought into focus, somebody would have said to Ginger, what is your background? What's happening? And then she could have got help. You can see I've thought about this a lot. And then on the very last scene where Wendy would get out of prison and who would be waiting for her with her red hair streaming down, you know, and just leaning against a tree. And they would have gone off together and tried to navigate a better way of being. And I can totally see that that would have worked. So I feel slightly regretful that I did kill her, if I'm being absolutely honest. Actually, before the final draft, at one point, everybody died. Everybody died. There was a complete bloodbath. But I was talked round from that. My editor said, you know, Elissa, this is not Reservoir Dogs. I said, oh, right, okay. So I did tone it down a bit. But yeah, I definitely think that there are other ways that I could have ended the story.
That's fascinating to hear that. Yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying there with how you could have ended it and Ginger could have been alive. And yeah, Ginger being alive at the end and Wendy getting out of prison, that would have been lovely. But at the same time, I think it is very poignant and it says a lot in itself that Ginger does die.
Yeah, I mean, definitely her life was getting worse and going downhill, and there wasn't anything obvious going to happen to stop that. It's a pity as well that Wendy is the way that she is. She takes everything at face value. So Ginger's saying, no, it's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine. And she just accepts that. And then at the end, or towards the end, when she realises that actually things are not okay with Ginger, she does try to help Ginger. It's just that her way of helping is wildly impractical. Oh, me, you and Diane can go off somewhere and we'll be a wee writing hut somewhere and in California, and we'll all live happily. Wildly impractical and never going to happen. But if Wendy had been a different person, maybe she could have done something for Ginger.
Yeah, Wendy was a great friend for Ginger, and at the same time, there is this feeling that Ginger needed to meet someone as well.
See, I feel of the two that Ginger was a better friend to Wendy than the other way round.
I'd agree.
Because Wendy, although she's 19, she's very, very young and immature. And Ginger introduces her to, oh, let's put makeup on. Let's go for a night out. Let's go for days out. So Ginger really broadens out Wendy's life experiences. I'm not sure that Wendy... I mean, she loves Ginger and she does her best, but I don't think that she helps her in the same way that Ginger helps Wendy.
Yeah, Ginger definitely loves Wendy. Wendy definitely loves Ginger. Yes, there is that unintentionally unequalness to their relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah. On Wendy herself, why was it important for Wendy to stay the same at the end? If I say to be lacking guidance, definitely lacking guidance, because she still seems to be not getting anywhere with that, unfortunately, and also lacking in social cues, etc.
I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head. There isn't really anybody who's helping her to turn things around. I like to think, though, that when Wendy comes out of prison, she does take a look around and say to herself, well, actually, my house is lovely now. I like my job. So I like to think that Wendy will come good at the end.
I like to think that Muriel and Sophie are there for her.
Yeah. And I would say that Sophie herself is quite a lost soul at times. So you can easily imagine that the pair of them might become good friends,
Be wonderful if it did, definitely. On this then, would you say that, yes, Wendy will be able to not necessarily heal, but learn coping strategies and find more friends? You think that's going to happen?
I do think that, because, although she's talking about, Ali Smith, and that's obviously, again, not appropriate, I think that throughout the novel, she's developing the whole time. And there's a scene at Christmas time where she's sitting in her house and she's starting to think a wee bit about her writing, and Sophie's giving her a lemon cake, and somebody buys her a beer at the writers group. And I think she is sort of becoming aware that I can make friends. I am like other people. People will like me for who I am. I think she's always going to be the way that she is, the character that she is. And I think that's right. It's back to what we were saying earlier. She doesn't have to change. She doesn't have to be like everybody else. She will always be just Wendy. But I do think that she will be able to cope better with her circumstances as she gets older.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree with that. There's nothing I can add to that. I just agree with it and hope for it. So, Ali Smith, I double-checked if Diane Weston was a real author. I found, okay, no, she's not. Okay. Then you'll use her your real author. And while obviously we've discussed Wendy and she will hopefully improve and stuff like that, you do kind of leave it on oh gosh, Ali Smith is going to be next. And that's a real author. That's quite bold of you, my goodness.
You say bold, again, I would say naive. But, Ali Smith, to me, comes across as a very thoughtful individual, a very caring person. I mean, her books, she's discussing all of humanity in her books. So I like to think that if Wendy did get in touch, she might be quite nice to her.
No, that's a very good point. Ali Smith is absolutely not Diane Weston. Regardless of whether Diane Weston, that she's a fictional person, Ali Smith is far better. So I can see the time. We've been talking for a while on this book. I could carry on talking about it, but I know we have to stop at some point. What's next? What are you working on?
Well, I've actually finished a second novel, which is set in Hamilton, which is the next town but one along from Uddingston, where I went to school, actually. So again, I know that town quite well. And it's about 4 women who have been friends since school. And they hit their 40s and they look around them and they think, life's not as great as we thought it might be when we were at school. All the things that we thought might happen don't appear to have happened. So they're concerned about things like lack of equal pay, sexual harassment in the workplace, and just generally sexual harassment of women. So dark themes, I guess. But like Ginger Me, there's a lot of dark humour in there as well. So when they see all these things happening, they think, well, how can we draw attention to this? They embark on a graffiti campaign in their local town, and they graffiti slogans on all the local buildings to raise awareness. And the novel really is about the fallout from that and the way that all four women realise, actually, we are worth more than this. And they change their lives to get what they deserve.
This sounds absolutely fabulous. Have we got a title?
Graffiti Girls.
Cool, okay. Oh, alliteration, everything. Love it. I love that you're staying local as well. That's great, yeah.
Yeah, I am. Like I said to you, I feel as though I know these places so I can describe them well. But I have to say, I am full of admiration for people, particularly historical writers, who write about 16th century Rome. And I think, how is that done? How are they doing that? You know, the research must be absolutely phenomenal. All I've got to do is walk up to Greg's and yes, that's research.
That's why you go to Greg's. Yes, okay.
Purely work.
So, Elissa, this has been fantastic having you on. And oh my goodness, I'm so glad I've read your book. It was indeed everything and more I was hoping for. Thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me and thanks for your fantastic questions.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Do join me next time. And for more information as to upcoming guests, check out wormholepodcast.com. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 80, was recorded on the 13th of June and published on the 14th of August, 2023. Music and production by Charlie Place.